Hello and welcome to Eagle Creek Park Nature Notes, the audio series created to help you plan your next visit to Eagle Creek Park in Indianapolis, Indiana. I'm Adam Hipschman, the Marketing and Program Coordinator for Eagle Creek Park Foundation. We're the primary nonprofit partner of Eagle Creek Park. I'm relatively new to this role, but I've been hiking in Eagle Creek Park for more than 10 years since I moved to Indianapolis. Connecting with the outdoors has always been a big part of my life.
And I'm Emily Storm Smith. I'm the current president of the Foundation Volunteer Board of Directors. I've been on the board since 2017, and I've been an Eagle Creek Park user for 25 plus years. As a native Central Indiana Hoosier, I've been coming here all my life, and in high school, I even rode on the Indy Youth Crew team. Now my family comes to the park at all times for outdoor activities, the playgrounds, hiking along the West Side trails, and enjoying the birds.
So Emily, today you're here to talk about the All Persons Trail on the west side of Eagle Creek Park. First, can you tell us what All Persons Trail is?
Yeah, when we were planning the West Side Trail expansion, we said one of the underserved groups in our park is people with limited mobility, people with disabilities, and just generally people that needed an easier surface for hiking in the outdoors. So we planned for what are called the ADA loops and as well as the all-person trails. Those terms have been used interchangeably. We planned for two of them to really increase the usability of our facilities for all the people in our community.
I noticed you doing it there, but for our listeners, can you explain a little bit about what person-first language is? Because it's kind of important for this conversation.
Yeah, it is. People are people. We all have interesting things about ourselves, but we don't define ourselves by any one of those traits. Having a disability, being a person with a disability, is just another trait that defines you. I have a child. I have a 9-year-old son, and he loves basketball, and he likes to play video games, and he happens to be a kid with limited mobility and disabilities. But that doesn't define every moment of his day. And that's, I think, the shift in language to make sure we talk about people who have struggles, just like anybody.
This is a particularly important topic for me as well. I spent a long time as a teacher working with lots of students with disabilities, and my own brother-in-law has Down syndrome. So I refer to him as my brother with Down syndrome, not a different way to refer to him, because you're right. That's not the only thing about him that's important.
Yeah. And it's not even sometimes the first thing you notice about a person. It's certainly a lot harder when someone may be like in a wheelchair, for example. That tends to be a very high visual cue, right? That there's a person who has some kind of disability. But a lot of people honestly wear their disabilities invisibly to the rest of the world. And one really hard thing about advocating for a community with a wide range of abilities and needs is that you can't judge someone based on what you can see. There are a lot of people that use wheelchairs that can walk. They just can't walk very far. Or there's a lot of people who aren't using a mobility aid who still need accommodations, things like parking in a handicap spot. And in the advent of social media, we've all seen videos of someone, getting yelled at for taking a handicap spot and someone saying, "You don't look like you need a handicap spot," but that's not what this is about, right? People have varying degrees of needs. People have varying degrees of visibility from their disabilities, and they also have varying degrees of needs for accessibility and accommodations. And I think that's really what the all-purpose trail is about letting our community decide for themselves each what their needs and their accommodations are.
So to kind of just recap that, person-first language means you'd say a person with a disability instead of, for example, a disabled person.
Yes.
That language is kind of out.
That is, yes.
Person with a disability is sort of the way you'd address.
Yeah. A person who is blind, a person who's a wheelchair user.
So what does it mean for a trail to be ADA accessible? And I guess what does ADA mean for those that might not know?
Yeah, I would disclaimer, I'm a lawyer. So the Americans with Disabilities Act is what we mean when we talk about the ADA. And the ADA has a wide variety of different accommodation requirements in it, specifically for different types of buildings and access. There are also just general standards, right? The highest level of standards for accessibility for anybody with specific types of disabilities would be living up to the ADA standards. What does it really mean to be ADA accessible? There's, again, I'm the lawyer, there's the legal definition, but then there's the real definition. The real definition in my mind is that if a person who has high needs and significant accessibility needs can come and park their car and get out and do the whole loop and have fun and not have to be stressed about making it over a ledge or trying to access the overlook so that they can enjoy the view of the reservoir. To me, what accessibility means is that someone can just drive up, get out of their car, enjoy it, and go home. And it had been as low friction and certainly as low stress experience as we can make it.
I've got some experience working with folks in wheelchairs from a camp that I ran. And from my perspective, this is a big deal because this provides a lot of dignity for folks. It does. It can be humiliating to turn up with a group of people and not be able to do what you want to do. And so taking barriers away, it's kind of giving me chills right now to talk about this. But it provides a lot of dignity for folks that in many aspects of their life may not have that, or maybe never had a chance to hike on a beautiful trail near a reservoir. And we can make that possible for them.
And especially when we talk about kids, right? Because kids start internalizing shame very early. And if they start having shame about something that they can't change, this is their body that they were born with, and they have needs, and those needs aren't shameful. But when you can't easily get into a building, or you can't go on the trail, or you have to sit out, whereas all of your friends get to go do something fun and you can't because you are in a wheelchair or you have to use a mobility aid. That is demoralizing. And it's just unkind, right? Like that is a terrible experience for that kid. So that's our goal, at least my goal, when I talk about how we're increasing accessibility and how the foundation is using its resources to increase accessibility about the park.
Speaking of the foundation, and you're the board president.
Current board president, yes.
What role did you play in the construction of the ADA, the accessible trails that we have here at Eagle Creek Park?
Yeah, so this project is much larger and longer living than me. I came on the board in 2017. The west side of the park had been a topic of discussion for almost a decade before that. What we were going to do with that, there were a lot of different proposals put forth to the city. Doing a community-focused walking trail with accessibility was the number one choice of the city. That's what they wanted. So we, at the foundation, in about 2015, 2016, started to truly look at funding options for that trail. And we knew it was going to be on the order of $3.5 to $4 million. So in about February of 2018, we got wind that the Lilly Endowment was going to be doing a special RFP grant process that would absolutely be in line with what we were doing. It was the Lilly Arts and Culture grant that they gave out that year. I don't know what the exact number was. It was definitely over $30 million that they gave out to organizations, mostly here in Marion County. And the first round application was actually due in March. And so we had less than 30 days to get the initial grant application done, which we did in-house. A couple of members of the board. At the time, I was the secretary of the board, but the president, Alex Upchurch, and the vice president at the time, Luann Baker, as well as one of our emeritus members, John Pankhurst, we put together the application really quickly. And we were fortunate enough to get everything we asked for. So Lilly contributed about $2.6 million. Another almost $300,000 came from the foundation and other donors. And we started building in January of 2019. And it was a long process. It's nearly, I think, 7 miles of trails to complete circular ADA loops, as well as a large trunk trail that goes through the middle of our West Side property. And I was really excited to be part of the team that put together that funding that then the city was able to use to build the asset.
So from this grant, or just in general, how many ADA trails are here on Eagle Creek Park property?
So currently, it is just the 2 that are with the West Side, the North Loop and the South Loop. We have this year, just this past year, received another nearly $2.5 million from the Lilly Endowment to do a 3rd trail on the east side by the Earth Discovery Center. That is the nature trail that they take most of the kids who come for school trips. They take them on. We are fully upfitting that to ADA compliant, and it's under construction now. So I think we're looking at about summer of 2024.
So Emily, we've got those 2 ADA trails, one on the north end of the west side, one on the south end. What I noticed is the difference between them is that the one on the south end near Bear Overlook is compacted stone, and the one on the north end is fully paved.
Yeah.
What can you tell me about the variability, the differences in ADA accessible trails, and why they might both count still?
There's a number of different surfaces that can be graded to the level needed for especially wheelchair users, and also to be compacted enough so that you're not getting like a lot of drag, especially on, again, people who are using pretty heavy wheelchairs. Well, I remember when we were looking at the ADA trails, when we were going through the construction, there were 3 or 4 different types of surfaces. All of them are top choices for compacted and wheelchair accessible trails. I think the real choice is, especially when we're talking about like a park, what did the nature need? What did the space need? I know that on the north side, there's less erosion problems on the north side. So think of potholes. You can pave in an area where there were fewer potholes. Those are some of the considerations that went in. Something like a compacted stone, something like that is something you can repair a lot easier. And when you've got erosion issues, these are just conversations we had. And I know that the city made choices based on functionally the type of soil and the availability and what was also already there. On the north end, there was an existing trail on the north end with the Starling Nature Preserve. So we also had a little bit better, I think, starting point on the north end. The Bear was something we started basically from scratch when we made that trail.
Is the northern trail at Scott Starling still considered ADA? I've been on it pretty recently, and you can tell that it was compacted stone, or it is compacted stone, but that it happened a while ago. Yeah. What can you tell me about its future as continuing as ADA accessible, or whatever you can tell me?
Yeah, that is, the city of Indianapolis owns the assets. It would be my intention to continue to advocate as the nonprofit partner for the park that any and all trails that were designed, graded, and surfaced as ADA be maintained in that way. We have money set aside for trail maintenance. So I don't know that there's a lot of maintenance open on the Scott Starling ADA trail, but it would be my intention to continue to advocate that we don't lose. It's just because we built a new loop up at the top that we don't lose any accessibility as we move forward.
To that end, Emily, I was curious before our conversation about what the ADA requirements are and sort of best practice in terms of like parks, maybe a little different than schools or churches and hospitals. And I found a very long document that we'll put in the show notes. The Forest Service put out like 180 pages worth of how do we make our national parks and Forest Service areas accessible in all ways, from trails to pit toilets to barbecues, stuff like that. Anyway, they have some really simple requirements for trails, just to kind of add this to the conversation. A firm surface that resists deformation by indentations.
Mhm.
So like you're saying, they're really vague there, I think on purpose, so that you can do what's best for the location.
Yeah. But you definitely don't want a heavy motorized wheelchair to be sinking into the surface.
Absolutely. The next is just that it be a stable surface that can be maintained over time.
Mhm.
So you mentioned potholes or maybe the Scott Starling grading. So there's two other requirements that I found. One is that the trail be a minimum, and they stress that it's a minimum of 36 inches wide, which is only about 3 feet, but recommend closer to like 4 or 5 feet wide for passing and things along those lines. And then the other thing is just no more than like a 3% slope. So it's not too steep up or down.
Yeah.
And so I just think it's interesting for folks maybe to know that the list of requirements is actually pretty short. It's about 4 things to make it accessible. But it's what are some limitations? Why aren't there more ADA trails at parks or even at our park?
That's a really good question. I'll take that in the opposite. I'll talk about our park first. This park was sold to the city in the mid to late 60s by Purdue University. It had been mostly owned by the Lilly and Allison families before that. And a significant amount of the park was constructed in the early 70s. In fact, we just celebrated our 50th anniversary in 2022, which means that the majority of the park was opened in 1972. And the ADA didn't really come around until the 80s. And a lot of the requirements didn't really start to ramp up until really the 90s. Why is there so few accessible points in our park? Is age, for sure. I think that is a very common theme as we go around the country and we say, why are especially large parks inaccessible? My husband and I took our son last fall to a state park here in Indiana, and it was a beautiful time. We had a really enjoyable visit. We drove around in the car, but it was not accessible. And, that's a park that's been there since probably the 1920s. So while I can't speak for every park that has accessibility issues, our park's accessibility issues is an age problem. Yeah, a lot of the assets, especially in growing cities that are still parks, are places that have been parks since the 60s, the 70s, maybe the 80s. But these assets were designated, the land was protected, and the park was constructed well before the ADA really forced compliance. And I'll say we're not out of compliance either. That's another problem. Not a problem, but that's another piece of this to say that Eagle Creek Park is not out of compliance with the ADA. You can go around our park in a lot of ways. There are a lot of places you can go if you are using mobility aids. The trails is just one place that we hadn't spent the time and the effort and the money to upgrade for accessibility needs.
On the whole, it sounds like progress is to be had in many places. It's just perhaps slow and steady. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, I think that's fair to say. And I think with anything, the hard part for me, again, as a parent of a child with disabilities, is when does it become the top thing on the priority list? When do you get to building new equipment that is more accessible? When do you get to redoing trails so that they're wheelchair user friendly? In this busy world of life, and we have a million priorities, and most people don't have to deal with this on a day-to-day basis. Most people don't have someone with significant disabilities in their life. And that's a good thing. But it makes it difficult when you sit around in a room full of people where maybe nobody in that room is dealing with this on a daily basis. It doesn't even bubble up to, the top 30 things that you might get done in a day. And anyone who knows me knows I'm not shy. And I walked in the door, and I'll be honest, I shoved my way in the door. Let's be quite clear. I sought out the Eagle Creek Park Foundation board, and I think the very first meeting I ever had with the then Vice President Luann Baker, we met at a coffee shop at 71st Street. And I said, if I get on this board, the thing I'm going to advocate for is kids with disabilities. Because at the time I had a 2-year-old son who was totally non-mobile. And I live right by the park. We can walk into the West Side Park. And I said, I want to bring my kid and I want to play. And we have accessibility needs. And I'm not going to be quiet about that. So I walked in the door saying every day, every meeting, what are we doing about accessibility? What are we doing about helping increases for our community? I think there's an interesting piece of this when you start to think about accessibility. And everybody starts from the point of a person who's using a wheelchair. But we forget that there are women out there who gave birth less than 3 months ago, who are still getting back in to their new body. And also that baby's in a stroller. And you also can't take a stroller with a newborn on a trail with a wood chip surface. There are people who just had knee replacements. There are people teenagers who've broken their ankles. When you build accessible trails, you don't just help the people who are at the extreme of accessibility needs, you expand accessibility for a huge swath of people in the middle. People who are maybe even only transitionally needing accessibility. And they call that the curb cut effect. They found out when the ADA required all of the different roads around the city and the country to start cutting curbs so that people in wheelchairs could get up on the curb and could cross the street. All of a sudden, the people who were using those curb cuts expanded exponentially. Again, teenagers on skateboards and moms with strollers and older people who just couldn't make the 3.5-inch step up on the curb. When we expand our world for people who have real needs, it is amazing and beautiful to see who else we help that was potentially unintended, but in this case, unintended consequences are a really great thing.
Totally agree. What I'm hoping through our conversation and then the surprise we've got for our listeners is that folks can gain a little bit more of that perspective of why it's worth it for everyone to have accessible, insert here, but especially an accessible trail. Before we started recording, we were talking a little bit about a comic book analogy in this sort of realm. Could you just briefly tell us a little bit about that idea?
Yeah. We think about stories and literature, and there's a lot of people out there that'll be like, oh, comic books, they're lowbrow. That's just for kids. But if you think about it, comic books they transcend language to something more human. You and I can speak not a word of the same language, but we can look at the same pictorial story and understand it, because human emotion is universal. Storytelling is universal. So while some people may grump about comic books, they are a really beautiful way of transcending our differences and communicating in a way that we all understand.
And I think that's what this concept of an all-persons trail is all about. It's a sort of a transcendent thing where it doesn't matter who you are, what you look like, where you're from, how able you are.
Yeah.
You can be part of this.
Whole families can enjoy them. Not just, again, the able-bodied, healthy 20-something. They can come with their grandparents. They can come with their nieces and nephews, whoever in your life needs accessibility, whole families, whole friends, whole groups can enjoy these trails together.
So, Emily, the surprise that we have for our listeners is we're actually going to go hike on the ADA trail on the south end of the west side.
Got my walking shoes on.
So, listeners, we'll meet you over there.
Yeah, fabulous. Very excited.
Hey, so we're here on the west side by Bear Overlook. It is the first right-hand turn after you go across the causeway if you're leaving the park. Emily, what do you think?
It's a beautiful day. I'm really excited to get to take a spin on the trail. So when we were talking with partners who wanted to use the trail, we actually reached out to several disability access groups here in Indiana and talked about, what are the usability problems with places like this? And the transition from the parking lot to the actual trail was specifically mentioned by at least two organizations that I talked to as the trail itself might be ADA, but if I can't get there, if there's a lip, if there's even one step down to get to the trail, then it's not usable. And so it doesn't matter, it doesn't matter what the Park Service says usability means. It doesn't matter what the ADA, legal language says it means. And as a lawyer, that really hurts my heart to say. But what matters is whether or not someone can get out of their car and actually use the trail. And so the transition area was really specifically designed to make sure that there were no stumbling blocks for someone either using a mobility aid or someone in a wheelchair.
Yeah, and if you come out, we're standing between the boundary of the parking lot and the ADA trail, and you'll notice this very smooth concrete area. You can imagine someone in a wheelchair, someone with a stroller rolling over this with absolutely no problem, and that's what we're hoping for.
There's a concept in design called 99% invisible. The most important things in your design, especially when you're talking about providing access to the general public, is all those things that no one sees. And this concrete pad, this transition area, is something that hopefully you never see.
So Emily, you've been involved for a long time in making this trail possible, and here we are standing on it. What can you tell me about standing right here?
Yeah, it feels really great. I think anybody that's been involved, especially a multi-year project, there are always ups and downs and heartaches and worries. At the very beginning, we had a lot of funding worries. Were we going to be able to get enough money to fund the project? And like I said before, this had been going on for almost 10 years before I even got involved. And I feel really proud that our organization, which is made up mostly of volunteers, Adam is one of only 3 actual employees at the foundation. Most of the people involved were volunteers, and we all got full-time jobs and families, and that we were able to push this over the hurdle. I'm really proud of the whole team that got it done.
And you've already discussed how important this is to you with your son. What does it feel like in that direction to be here?
Yeah, my family is incredibly privileged in a lot of ways. We have the ability and the resources to make sure our son gets to do what he wants to do. But I know that that's not true for every family. And I know that when we have frustrations and struggles, that there are other people in our community that feel those 10 times. So being here, knowing that this would be pretty easy for us, pretty seamless, I'm really grateful to know that we've also provided that for the community at large. And that, I can say as a user, this is a positive experience for people who have disabilities and for people who have mobility needs.
Listeners, thanks so much for joining us for this episode of Eagle Creek Park Nature Notes. I've been Adam Hipschman.
And I'm Emily Storm Smith.
To see full episode transcriptions and to learn more, visit eaglecreekpark.org. Subscribe or follow the podcast in Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Audible, or wherever you listen to podcasts, so that new episodes will be delivered to you as soon as they're available.